A single sentence spoken in front of an entire town changed the course of two lonely lives forever. Nobody standing on the boardwalk that Tuesday morning expected to witness the beginning of a story people would talk about for years. The stagecoach finally rolled into town after 3 long days on the road, and Clara Bennett stepped down carrying a worn suitcase and the hope that had kept her company through every mile. She had never met the man waiting for her, but his letters had promised kindness and a future worth believing in. Instead, before she could even properly greet him, that hope was broken in front of everyone. Welcome to Wild West Tales Stories, where unforgettable frontier romances come to life. If stories of honor, loyalty, and true love speak to your heart, make sure you subscribe and become part of our growing family, because some journeys are too beautiful to miss. Nathan Carter stood beside the hitching post with disappointment already written across his face. His eyes swept over Clara, and then he spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. He said she was not what he had imagined. The words cut deeper than the cold wind that had followed her across the plains. Conversation stopped around them. A woman carrying fresh bread paused in the middle of the street. A boy holding a water bucket stood still. Even the blacksmith lowered his hammer. Clara could feel every eye on her, but she kept her hands at her sides and held her head high. Nathan continued speaking, saying that a man had the right to his expectations and that he had pictured something different. Clara had spent too many years learning how to hide her hurt, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. He was still speaking when heavy boots came down the wooden steps of the hardware store. The man crossing the street moved with the calm confidence of someone who never rushed and never needed to. He was broad-shouldered and rugged, with rough hands shaped by years of honest labor. Without hesitation, he stepped between Clara and Nathan. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. His voice was calm, but there was strength behind every word. He simply said that was no way to treat a lady. Nathan straightened angrily and declared that it was none of his business. The stranger answered quietly that the moment Nathan chose to humiliate her in front of the whole town, he had made it everyone's business. There was no anger in his voice, only truth. He told Nathan that he had said enough and that he was finished. Nathan looked around and realized every pair of eyes was watching him. He measured the stranger's size, looked once more at Clara, and finally understood that he had already lost the respect of the town. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Slowly, the people around them returned to their business, and the sound of life came back to the street. The stranger turned toward Clara and asked gently if she had family in town. Clara swallowed hard. The answer was simple. No. Whatever future she had imagined had disappeared with the sound of Nathan's horse. The stranger bent down and picked up her suitcase before she could protest. He introduced himself as Elias Walker and explained that he lived alone in a cabin up the ridge and had a spare room she could use until she decided what to do next. Clara studied the man standing before her. He was not polished or charming. He was simply a man who had seen something wrong and walked across the street to make it right. They began the climb toward the mountains together, and neither of them wasted words trying to fill the silence. Below them, the town grew smaller while the distant peaks glowed beneath the evening sun. After nearly an hour, they reached a quiet cabin overlooking the valley. A chestnut horse raised its head from the corral before returning to its hay. Inside, everything reflected the man who lived there. Tools were neatly arranged. The fireplace was clean. Nothing was fancy, but everything had its place. Elias showed Clara the small room in the back and told her that the window faced east, where the sunrise looked best. He explained that he left before daylight each morning, and that coffee would already be brewing when she woke up. Clara looked around the room and quietly said that she could cook. For the first time, something close to a smile appeared on his face. He simply answered that the pantry had needed help for a long time. When he left her alone, Clara stood by the window and watched the golden light spread across the mountains. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she allowed herself to breathe. She unpacked slowly, placing her comb beside the window and hanging her dress carefully. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees while the valley below faded into evening shadows. She had arrived in town believing she was beginning one life, only to lose it in a matter of minutes. Yet somehow, in the kindness of a quiet mountain man she had met less than 2 hours earlier, She found something she had not expected to find at all: safety. And though neither of them knew it yet, the stranger who had defended her in front of the entire town was about to become far more important than either of them could imagine. Their story was only beginning, and what awaited them in the days ahead would change both of their lives forever. The next morning, Clara Bennett woke before sunrise to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of the wind brushing against the pines outside the cabin. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the memories of the stagecoach, the humiliation, and the quiet mountain man who had offered her shelter returned. Through the kitchen window, she saw Elias Walker heading toward the hills with his horse, disappearing into the morning mist before the first rays of sunlight touched the valley. He had kept his promise. Coffee was waiting. There had been no speeches, no questions, and no expectations. Just simple kindness. Clara explored the pantry and quickly understood what Elias had meant when he said it needed help. There was flour, a little salt pork, some dried beans, and not much else. She smiled to herself and decided she could do something with it. By the time Elias returned that evening, tired from working in the mountains, the smell of hot soup filled the cabin. He stepped inside, removed his coat, and stopped for a second. Clara noticed the surprise in his eyes. He sat down without saying much and quietly ate. When he finished, he simply reached for another bowl. Somehow, that small action meant more to Clara than a dozen compliments. Days slowly settled into a rhythm. Elias left before daylight, and Clara had breakfast waiting when he returned. He never asked her to do anything, and she never felt like a burden. There was something peaceful about the silence they shared. It was not awkward. It was comfortable. They spoke when words were needed and let the quiet speak for the rest. Clara began learning little things about him. He checked his tools carefully, fed his horse with patience, and repaired broken things without complaint. Nothing about Elias demanded attention. Yet every small action revealed the kind of man he truly was. A week later, a heavy rainstorm rolled down from the mountains. While preparing supper, Clara noticed water dripping from a corner of the ceiling. She placed a pot underneath and decided not to mention it. She was still a guest, and she didn't feel it was her place. That evening, Elias returned home and immediately noticed the pot sitting beneath the leak. He said nothing. Clara said nothing. They simply ate supper while the rain tapped against the roof. The next morning, she found a bundle of cedar shingles and a tin of pitch resting neatly on the workbench. 3 days later, while brushing the horse outside, she heard steady hammering above her. Looking up, she saw Elias repairing the roof. By evening, the leak was gone. Neither of them mentioned it. Somehow, they understood each other without needing explanations. As the weeks passed, the cabin slowly changed. The pantry became fuller. Fresh bread often cooled on the kitchen table. Elias repaired the squeaky door to Clara's room without telling her. He chopped extra wood before the colder nights arrived. Clara mended worn shirts and repaired tears in old blankets. None of it felt like duty. It simply became the way they cared for each other. On Thursdays, Elias took Clara into town to buy supplies. At first, people stared. The whole town remembered the woman abandoned in the street. But little by little, opinions changed. Mrs. Harper, the baker's wife, greeted Clara with a smile. The schoolteacher asked if she would help teach younger children 2 mornings each week. Even the storekeeper, who once watched her with curiosity, now treated her with warmth and respect. People noticed something else too. Whenever Clara and Elias walked together, neither one tried to lead. They simply matched each other's pace as though they had been doing it for years. One evening, while washing dishes, Clara heard music coming from the porch. She quietly stepped outside and found Elias sitting alone with an old guitar resting in his hands. The melody was soft and gentle, carrying through the valley like a memory. His large, rough hands moved carefully across the strings. There was sadness in the tune, but peace as well. He looked up, almost embarrassed to be caught. "Didn't know anyone was listening," he said. Clara smiled softly. "I was hoping you'd play it again." Without another word, Elias started over. Clara sat beside him on the porch steps, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains while the music drifted into the evening sky. Neither of them spoke after the final note faded. Words weren't necessary. Days later, Clara noticed the old leather guitar case had started coming apart. One morning while Elias was away, she carefully repaired the damaged stitching and returned it exactly where she had found it. That evening, when Elias discovered it, he stood quietly holding the case. He ran his fingers along the new stitching and said nothing. During supper he was unusually quiet, and Clara wondered if she had upset him. Then, as she passed him the bread, he looked up and spoke only 3 words. "Thank you, Clara." For most people it would have been a small thing, but for Elias Walker, those 3 words carried the weight of 1,000, and though neither of them realized it, the people in town had already started whispering, because everyone could see what 2 stubborn hearts were still too afraid to admit. And far away in another town, the man who had rejected Clara Bennett was beginning to hear stories that would soon bring him riding back. By the time autumn painted the mountains gold, the people of Willow Creek had stopped calling Clara Bennett the woman who had been abandoned at the stagecoach station. Now they spoke of her differently. She was the woman who taught children at the schoolhouse on Tuesdays and Fridays, the woman whose bread disappeared quickly at church gatherings, the woman who had somehow brought warmth back into the cabin of the mountain, man everyone respected. And though neither Clara nor Elias Walker talked about it, the town had already made up its mind. People smiled when they saw them together. They nodded knowingly when the 2 of them walked side by side through the general store. Even Mrs. Harper had begun telling newcomers that some things were decided by the Lord long before people understood them. But 2 towns away, Nathan Carter had heard those same stories, and they did not sit well with him. At first he dismissed them. Then he learned that Clara was respected. He heard that Elias Walker was buying extra flour, coffee, and even a ribbon from the general store. He heard laughter had returned to the mountain man's cabin, and something inside Nathan refused to accept that another man had become the better version of the story. Pride had a way of making foolish men believe they deserved second chances they had never earned. On a bright Saturday morning, Clara and Elias were leaving the general store when a horse stopped in the middle of the road. Clara froze. Nathan Carter stepped down and removed his hat. He had practiced the expression on his face: regret, humility, reason. But Clara saw something else beneath it: pride. He greeted her politely and admitted that he had spoken badly that day months ago. He claimed the long journey and unexpected circumstances had clouded his judgment. He even dared to say that their original arrangement could still continue if she was willing to be sensible. The street grew quiet. People paused outside shops. The town remembered what had happened the first time. Nathan glanced toward Elias, who stood a few feet away with a coil of rope resting over his shoulder. The mountain man had not moved. He had not stepped between them. He had not interrupted. Instead, he simply watched Clara, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. That alone told the whole town everything they needed to know about the difference between the 2 men. Nathan continued speaking, trying to sound reasonable. He reminded Clara of the plans they once had. He spoke as though nothing had changed. But Clara looked at him calmly and remembered standing in that same street with nowhere to go, and no one willing to stand beside her. She remembered the humiliation. She remembered his voice. And then she remembered another voice. A quiet voice that had crossed the street for a stranger and asked for nothing in return. "You were clear that day," Clara said softly. "And I was clear when I walked away." Nathan forced a smile. "A man can make mistakes." Clara nodded, "and a woman can learn from them." The words settled over the street like a gentle wind. Nathan searched her face, hoping to find doubt. But there was none. The answer he wanted no longer existed. Slowly he put on his hat. Without another word, he climbed onto his horse and rode away. This time, no one watched him leave. Instead, every eye turned toward Clara. The silence lingered until normal sounds returned to the town. Mrs. Harper finally released the breath she had been holding. The storekeeper smiled quietly. Life resumed. Then Elias stepped beside Clara. "You didn't need me for that," he said. Clara looked up at him and smiled. "No." Then after a moment she added softly, "But I'm glad you were here." The cold breeze moved through the street between them. Elias shifted the rope on his shoulder and looked toward the mountains. "Come home," he said simply. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just one word: home. And somehow, It was the most beautiful word Clara had ever heard. They walked back to the ridge together, and a week later the preacher visited the cabin. The wedding was quiet, simple, and attended by people who truly cared for them. Nothing changed much afterward because nothing needed to. The morning still began with coffee. Elias still left before sunrise. Clara still taught the children at the schoolhouse. The two old chairs remained at the kitchen table, and neither of them ever thought about replacing them. Winter eventually covered the mountains with snow. One evening, as the stars shone brightly above the valley, Clara heard the familiar sound of Elias's guitar coming from the porch. She dried her hands and stepped outside. This time she didn't stand in the doorway. She sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth in the cold night air. He played the same melody his father had once taught him, and together they watched the stars appear above the silent mountains. Neither of them spoke, because life had already said everything that mattered, and some kinds of love are too honest to need many words. Thank you for spending this journey with Wild West Tales Stories. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because somewhere beyond the next mountain, another unforgettable tale of courage, loyalty, and love is waiting for you, and you won't want to miss it.